Thanks everybody for attending. There's some people in the back. I sort of feel like it's church. They're way in the back. I want them to come forward. So this session, it's not going to be a lecture. What we're going to try to do is to make this interactive, be able to answer questions. I think last year that was something that people enjoyed doing. I'm going to introduce, once again, everybody up on the front here, and then maybe give about a 10, 12-minute overview of new therapies and clinical trials, just to hopefully set the stage for things that you can understand a little bit more about what's really, up around the next bend. And then I also wanted to have these part of our science team to talk about one or two things that they're excited about each. And then we'll throw it open to questions, and please feel free to ask. There's no question is out of bounds. So my name is Mike Boyle. I help lead some of the science at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation along with the rest of my team here. But let me have everybody introduce themselves. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Tony Dermowitz, who joined us about a month and a half ago, almost 2 months, who we couldn't be more excited by. So Tony, you want to give a little bit of background?
Hi, I'm Tony Dermowitz, and I'm a pediatric pulmonologist and critical care physician who spent a lot of time in academic medicine, mostly at University of Colorado, doing a lot of basic science research in lung development. I spent some time also in the pharmaceutical industry at MedImmune for a couple years, developing monoclonal antibodies for asthma. And most recently, I was at the Food and Drug Administration for the past 12 and a half years, where I helped review pulmonary allergy and rheumatology drugs.
And so Tony does a really good job of being humble, but he was an absolutely centerpiece, a key part of this whole ability to use in vitro data to be able to expand the use of some medicine. So we, things like Kalydeco, which expanded the number of mutations, and that was Tony's work at the FDA. So anyway, Tony, we're glad you're here and on our team. Patty.
Hi there, I'm Patty Burks. I've gotten to meet some of you. I've been at the foundation now 2.5 years, helping support the 89 sites that do our studies across the country. Before that, I was a research coordinator at Washington University in St. Louis. Yay, go Cards. Yeah. And it's just a joy to be here today. Thank you.
And also a CF mom.
Oh yeah. That's right. Oh yeah.
And then Dara.
Hi, I've met many of you today and in previous VLCs. My name is Dara, and I started at the Foundation a little bit more than a year ago, and I oversee the investigator-initiated clinical research projects. And I am, by the way, also a CF mom. I have 2 children with CF, 8 and 6, and they're doing great.
So a lot of passion on our team. So let's just do this. I'm going to give you about a 10-minute or so overview of some of the things that we're excited by. Then we'll have a couple people talk about their specific things, and then we'll discuss. So I think one of the ways that it may be helpful, you hear about all these different things going on at the Foundation, right, and all this different research, and this is the way that I tend to think about how it's broken down. And we're going to particularly focus, so anyway, break it down in sort of these different areas, with the things at the top being the most basic science, things which are the earliest. That would be Bill Skatch territory and his team. And then overlap with our team, which is sort of in this red box, which is really when we start to get into testing new therapies in people with cystic fibrosis. So these are the phase 2 and phase 3. Some of these are working with drug companies. Some of these are actually trials that we know that no drug company is going to do because maybe it's not going to make a lot of money, but we think it's important for people with cystic fibrosis, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the other one is one Dara mentioned, is actually we obviously support investigators who are in the community who say, I've got a good idea. And so these are not drug companies. These are maybe some of your doctors or investigators at the medical centers that you're at who say, I've got a good idea, and they can submit for grants, and we support that. And then there's also other research, which we won't go into, but it's more sort of registry, once drugs are approved, sort of clinical care research. But we're going to focus on this red box and just try to give a couple of key messages without going into too much depth. I think one of the key things is that there's a lot going on, right? This is the number of new interventional trials. Interventional means that people who are participating are getting some new therapy to be tested. And I put this up for 2 reasons. One is you can see that there's a lot of, these are just the new ones. There's a bunch of new ones scheduled for this year. We always talk about CFTR modulators, and obviously that's the one we hear about, but the truth is if you add up the rest of them, they actually greatly outnumber the CFTR modulators, and that's because of this whole important message of saying we know that we need to continue to aggressively develop drugs that treat symptoms of cystic fibrosis, even as we try to get better and better modulators. But let's just do a little overview of what to expect in these trial areas. So one of these would be the CFTR modulator trials that are going to continue to advance this whole area of CFTR modulators. That you're probably familiar with the Vertex next generation trial. This is that triple combination that we were talking about. The exciting thing is that's actually starting now. It started last week, started enrolling for people that have a single F508del mutation. It'll also include some people that have two F508del mutations. There's actually 2 different compounds that are being tested. So this is an obvious one that everybody's going to be following. But just to highlight that there are multiple other companies that are also developing modulators, including Galapagos, AbbVie, and Proteostasis, which also have their own triple. Now, we don't know quite as much about it. It looks promising from what we've seen. Obviously, Vertex is ahead there. But I think it highlights how important it is that we continue to have lots of options, I guess I should say. And then there's other companies as well, the John Flatley Lab out of Boston. And then I'll say that there's some other companies that are also working that have really exciting things in the lab and are getting close to clinic. But we actually spent a decent amount of time with them. Tony and I just had a meeting with a couple of these companies in the last week or two, hearing about some of the specifics and helping them to move forward. That one of the other things I think is just an important theme to know about is, like I said, Tony had really led this whole thought process of how can we use the lab to help us to be able to study rare mutations to see which patients might be able to benefit from these therapies, even if they have rare mutations. So that's something that we're going to continue to work on. And then the other thing is this idea of, somebody asked yesterday, how are we going to continue to do these trials when there's existing therapies? Well, there's some really neat designs now where you only require short periods of time on placebo or maybe no placebo at all, which will allow us to continue to advance this field. And so just an example of this I put up here is this is actually the phase 3, the pivotal study for that triple. When you look at this, and this is, I know it's a little bit technical, but the bottom line is you have this screening period, and then you have some patients who will go on this triple combination. And this is actually for patients with just one F508del mutation, so they don't have a treatment right now. So they either get this triple or the placebo. But the thing that I think is pretty neat is that they are actually going to get a readout after 1 month. They have the design, so after 1 month, they're going to look and see how this is working. So we're going to hear, as opposed to saying 6 months later, we're going to wait and wait and wait and wait some more, that actually after 4 weeks, we're likely to have some insight into how this is going. And then it'll be interesting to see, depending on effect, there may be some options there as they continue to work with the FDA. But that's so much different and so much faster than before. I think that's a neat thing to think about. The other thing was we've talked about this last 5 to 7% of people who need something that modulators won't do the trick. And so I just mentioned that one of these that's going to be starting in trial is actually an RNA Delivery from Translation Bio. It's a company that actually puts the correct copy of the cystic fibrosis RNA inside a shell. And this shell allows it to be able to be inhaled into the lungs and be delivered into cells. And so the whole idea here is it doesn't really matter what mutation you have, because if this could work, and right now it looks promising in animals, although this is really early, this could actually put the correct copy of the code into the cells to allow it to make the cystic fibrosis protein, and it wouldn't matter what your mutation is. And then we mentioned anti-inflammatories. I put this slide up in the talks yesterday, but there's 3 different ongoing programs that are going to tell us whether or not this whole idea of treating inflammation, again, it doesn't matter what your mutation is, can make a difference. Celtaxis, oops, I'm missing a T there, that's Celtaxis. That result will actually be back this summer. Corbus is starting their pivotal trial later on this summer, and Laurent is ongoing. Poly4 is probably a little bit behind. They've changed companies. A lot of that's going to be going on in Europe, but I would expect that would tee up later on this year. So a big year, not just for modulators, but for inflammatories, anti-inflammatories. And then the other thing is the anti-infectives. Dr. Skatch yesterday, remember he had that list we went through, lots and lots and lots of things that were going on. These are the ones that are actually into people and being tested. So right now, inhaled vancomycin for MRSA. So this is an MRSA treatment. This other one, fosfomycin, tobramycin, we're trying to get going this year. This would be for difficult to treat Pseudomonas, but also could help MRSA. There's a couple other ones, gallium, gallium and nitric oxide, which really treat multiple organisms, including Pseudomonas, but also NTM potentially, even fungal. And then there's a couple of earlier, one particular earlier program, Alaxia over in Europe, itraconazole dry powder. Itraconazole dry powder would be for fungus, which people have asked about. This is really a broad spectrum one, although it's early. And then this was that, we put this in this list just because of the hearing that comes, the hearing problems that can come for some people with treated with tobramycin or antibiotics. That this is, there's some programs to try to help with the hearing or prevent the hearing in this group. And I'll just mention one or two sort of fun ones. This is another one. So there's a drug called Icloprim. Everybody always asks what's going on for Cepacia, what's going on for Achromobacter, what's going on for Stenotrophomonas. This is a company that we're excited by because they have a drug called Icloprim, which can potentially treat any of those three, at least what we see in the lab. But they're actually pretty far along. They've actually already, in non-cystic fibrosis, have showed that their drug works for skin infections and for certain types of staph and strep infections. But the great thing is that this is positive here for this study that they do. It's sort of low-hanging fruit where we could actually automatically take over that. It's already been approved and bring it into cystic fibrosis. What we're specifically doing is having them doing lots of testing against Cepacia, against Achromobacter, against MRSA, so that we could demonstrate whether or not this might be something to be able to help people with those infections. And this is another one that's early. It's an inhaled calcium EDTA. That's mixed with inhaled tobramycin, which actually tends to make the tobramycin work better. At least that's what we've seen. This was actually in a trial from Australia where they looked at people who just took regular tobramycin versus adding in this calcium EDTA and actually had a pretty remarkable improvement in FEV1. It was a little bit complicated because it was during exacerbations, so it's not the typical numbers that we are used to looking at, but we were excited enough that we're supporting them to be able to move forward, and they're actually going to start off moving forward quickly in Australia and then come to the US. And then I'll just to mention the last couple of categories. Mucociliary clearance, obviously that's one that's the bread and butter. Some of the ones that are ongoing right now, there's a drug called Oligo-G, which had a phase 2 study which actually didn't quite make it. Basically didn't look as promising as we'd hope. They're changing the dose to see whether or not that can make a difference, and that trial is ongoing in Europe. There's some other drugs, these things called Enoch Inhibitors. And just so you remember, Enoch is a different channel that lines the lung, lines the surface of the lungs, which helps control the salt and water balance along with the cystic fibrosis channel. And it turns out that it's overactive in cystic fibrosis. So if we could block that, and this works in animals, although we haven't seen it work in people yet, if you can block that channel, the lung linings wouldn't be so dried out. So 3 different companies all working on ways to block that. Those are ongoing trials, so we should know a lot about the potential effectiveness of Enoch inhibitors in these next 2 years. The one that's particularly coming out this summer is this Spyrix product, which will be interesting to see the results of. And then just to talk about, we've talked about the sort of the drug company part, but just to highlight, the money that you help raise goes to way more than just these companies. Obviously, that's one of the things we're excited about. We want to bring them forward, but there's a whole network that allows us to be able to do these trials. So as soon as we're ready and there's something promising, we can plug that in. So we spend about $25 million a year, and actually, truthfully, this number will end up bigger. Because we end up sort of adding to a couple of programs during the year, but we'll end up spending about $25 million each year just to support all the research programs. So when you go to be part of a clinical trial and you're meeting with your research coordinator or you're getting some of those tests done, that's staff that's paid for by the work that you do. And then also DARA and runs this whole program, the clinical research, where we ask for people for good ideas that aren't related to drug companies. And that's about another $25 million that's set aside for that. And then some other clinical trials that we just do on our own because pharma's not interested. So this is just on the clinical trial part alone. That's over $50 million that we're putting into trying to help. What that does is that leverages, though, you think about all the money that drug companies put in, they come into this space because we know that we're going to help them. And we know that they have, a community that's committed. And so that $50 million actually ends up with hundreds of millions of dollars of investment from drug companies for new therapies for CF. And so the last couple of sections here, I would just mention those. I'm not going to go through all of these, maybe just one line. These are the trials where we basically, as a science team, said, hey, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation needs to work on this because there's no drug company that will. And so those are the ones that are really on our responsibility. So some of these have been long-term effects of ivacaftor. We'd like to know what other things that ivacaftor does. We did the same thing with Prospect. This is gallium we've talked about. This is one of my favorite studies. This is going to tell us how long we should be treating exacerbations with IV antibiotics. That'll probably be finishing up not this year but next year. But it may be that we don't need to treat for 14 days. It may be that we can get away with 10 days. That would be a big difference, right? Rather than another 4 days on IV antibiotics. So this is a neat study. This is looking at hypertonic saline in children. This is looking at the interaction between azithromycin and inhaled tobramycin. This is studying glutathione. Turns out glutathione probably doesn't help all that much for the lungs, but there's some evidence it might help for gaining weight. So that's being done. And that's probably some of the key ones. And then just last thing I'll mention is a couple specific programs. People ask about NTM. What are we doing all the time? I know Bill Skatch talked about this yesterday, but one of the things that you're going to be hearing a lot about in these upcoming couple years is the NTM Treatment Consortium, which is a group of centers from all around the country that are focusing specifically on sort of developing best care standards, as well as doing clinical trials to figure out how to treat abscessus and how to treat MAC, because we know this is an increasing problem. And one other neat study that the foundation's doing is basically looking at how sweat correlates with how people are doing on modulators. We know that when modulators work really well, they tend to improve your sweat. Right? We've seen that in the Kalydeco studies where normally your sweat, if you have CF, is up around 100. The Kalydeco studies show that they can reduce that down to the 50 range or below. That's getting to be the almost, not diagnostic. We think that this down the road could be something that we almost measure like a blood pressure, that you could check sweat chloride and try to say, hey, how are they doing with their modulator treatment? But we need data to be able to get that relationship. So there's this big study right now where we're going to be checking sweats over time as people take modulators. And that's going to help us for down the road. And then GI, I think we had a question specifically about, what are we doing for GI? There's a whole group that's actually diving in on this. Dara was in Seattle. Maybe you're going to talk about this. I won't steal your thunder. Okay, all right. She's going to talk about it in a second. Great. So, I think I don't want to talk at you guys too much. I would just say that the other key part about this is you've seen some of these messaging about how important it is that we all work on this together. That all of these trials sound great, but they only work if people with cystic fibrosis are willing to participate in them, to work together on their team, to be able to get answers about which ones work and which ones don't. And with all of the things that are going on, that is an issue, that sometimes some of these takes longer to enroll than we'd like. And so part of this is if you look at our website, if you actually check on social media, you'll see some of these type of things where we're really trying to spread that word about the importance of all hands on deck. This is an incredibly exciting time for therapies, but it's only going to work if we all do this together. So let's do this. Actually, maybe what we'll do is then I'm going to have each member of our team talk about something they're particularly excited by. And then we'll sort of go to questions. And if there's no questions, we're happy to talk some more, but it's probably more fun if this is a conversation. So, Tony, maybe we should start with the ladies first. Is that all right? Dara?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. So Mike said, I'm gonna ask you what's one thing you're really excited about. And I was like, just one thing. And he's like, we only have 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about the GI study, and I think that it's so important that we recognize how much GI is an issue with our population, with the CF population. And I really think it speaks volumes that Danny, during the when he Skyped in, talking about his transplant, how the breaking point, the straw that almost broke his back, was a GI issue. Just to really echo how important GI issues can be to people with CF. So really exciting stuff is coming. It's very, very early, and we've just started the planning process, but we're really going to start tackling these issues. And the first step is really to find out how can we measure what these issues are. With lung, we have FEV1, right? So people who have a low FEV1, we know they're getting better when that FEV1 score gets higher, but we don't have that kind of measure for GI. So that's step one. And when we get that, which won't take long, then we're going to start with interventional studies and really tackling how can we start to solve these problems. So I encourage everybody to join Community Voice if you haven't already, because we are talking to the community to find out what are these symptoms you're feeling and how do we measure it, because we need your help. And so that's what I think I'm most excited about. Both of my kids have GI issues. I call them my GI babies because the lung issues aren't really there right now. They're 8 and 6, but GI is it. So that's it, and I'll pass it on to Patty.
So thank you, Dara. I'm so proud of you and all the work that you're doing. It's fun. She's my next door neighbor down the hall at the foundation. Stop by and visit us. What am I most excited about? Well, I really am very excited about the next gen modulator trials that are starting right now. But then I thought, well, maybe I'm most excited that it's going to be the 20th anniversary of the starting of the Therapeutics Development Network this spring. That's amazing, because that's the network across the country that's gotten these studies done. And that's pretty amazing. But then I thought, this is how you get three things.
How did she get 3?
I know. I am most excited about the patients and families who participate in clinical trials. It comes at a price and an inconvenience. You guys, I'm excited about you guys. Thank you. That's what I'm excited about, Mike.
Great. Tony?
I'll be pretty brief. I think that what I'm excited about trying to help do is help develop within the CF community a universal system that's recognized across drug companies, not just with one drug company's products like Vertex, to be able to use in vitro data to support both drug approval and drug optimization for individual patients once a drug is approved. So I think that's one of the things. When I first started here, you have to have your individual goals when you're an employee. I think people know that in what you're going to do, and that was one of the one or two ones of the few of them that I have. So that's what I'm going to try to work for.
Perfect. So I think you guys are going to give.
Yeah.
Why don't we give these guys, the ones who are here, you're going to take a microphone out into the crowd. So I guess we're going to take questions now, if people are interested. And Dara, do you have some that are?
I don't have any here.
Okay.
Patty, which one are you taking? That one? Should I?
Okay, I'm on
Angie's going to start us off.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk with the triple combo trials starting. I'm wondering, I know the one with the one copy of Delta 508 is already started rolling. How about the double Delta? And also with just 100 participants, are we expecting that enrollment process to happen super quickly or take some time? Or what is our thoughts, if any, on that so far?
Maybe I can take that one, or Tony, you want to take that one? Okay. So the answer is that double. You're right. So there's two different trials. The single has started. The double is actually going through protocol review right now, which usually means that probably in the next 2 months. That things have been going faster, so it could be even faster than that. So maybe it's the next 6 weeks. I think you raised a really key point, though. There's only about 100 people in that trial, and so that's going to enroll like hotcakes. I think one of the things that we've been trying to let people know is that there's going to be people who want to try to get into those specific trials that may not be able to. Really, it'd be something you need to talk with your care team and your research team about so that they can actually be aware of your interest. I know your daughter has. The one good news about this is because things are moving so fast, that it's likely that for people, for instance, who are particularly sick, may have some early access. Tony, do you want to talk at all a little bit about that? If there's a trial that, if from the FDA standpoint, if one of these trials looks particularly promising, if there might be opportunities for people who are really sick to have earlier access than waiting for approval.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike said, the trials are going to go very fast. The endpoints are actually front-loaded with regard to when they're going to do a blinded efficacy assessment. If the drug at that early time point shows a positive effect, then certain things come into play with regard to submitting an application even before the rest of the study is done. And once you have that kind of information, there's other regulatory mechanisms to make a drug which by all practical purposes works be accessible before you take the 6 months or so, finish the study, and then another 6 months to review it. So it's a kind of an early access program, if you will. And it would be for everybody. It wouldn't necessarily be for somebody with any special circumstances. So that's something that, Vertex, trust me, is an expert at these kind of things. I think that those things might happen, especially with the study that's just started with the single 508 population, because that's one where there's no drug available, and people take that for unmet need, if you will, into consideration during the consideration for those things.
That makes sense.
Patty, while you're walking to the next question, we got one from online. So the question is GI issues. I have one child with CF and all the lung issues and pancreas sufficient. Then one child with Crohn's GI issues, no lung issues. Is this being looked at? And I hear this so many times from parents, sometimes then they have two children with CF, they say, one is my lung baby and one is my GI baby, so I understand this. I can talk a little bit about the GI studies. We're not looking specifically at Crohn's, but there is complications that are, revolve around that and other things. And the first step really of these GI studies is to look at the GI symptoms in entirety and understand, is it constipation, is it bloating, and really understand the GI symptoms, and then we'll dive into more interventional stuff. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a theme here over the next couple of years where some of these specialty areas, so the specialty areas include GI, it's already happened in diabetes, but it's going to happen even more, sinuses as well, where typically you send your patient to somebody else to see them, and they may not have a lot of CF expertise, or maybe they've developed it over time, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that those other doctors and care teams within those specialty areas, particularly GI and sinuses and diabetes, become part of the CF community as well. We're going to draw them in, have special programs where we bring them to the North American meetings, bring them in to fund their research, actually buy some of their time, so they can actually be the same people that help with the clinical care will also be people that will drive some of the research in these specialty areas down the road. So,
Hi, can you tell us a little bit about Pseudomonas? What percentage of CF people have Pseudomonas? What does it do? And what are some possible ways to attack it or alleviate its effects?
Sure. Maybe I can start off with that, and then if anyone wants to chip in. So, it's interesting. We used to say, my thing I used to teach my fellows all the time was 80% by age 18. That meant about 80% of people with cystic fibrosis have chronic Pseudomonas infection by the age of 18. Something's very interesting happening. That's not true anymore. The number's actually a little lower. And that's because the treatment's gotten better. And the other thing is that now when Pseudomonas is first detected, and probably some of you have gone through this, but as soon as a person with cystic fibrosis has that detected, we actually try to eradicate that. And then oftentimes can delay that for a couple of years. So the number now it depends. It depends on your age, but as you get older and closer to 18 in adulthood, it does continue to go up. It's now more in the 70% range, and maybe even a little bit lower. But that number is actually coming down. There's two ways I would say to treat that. Number one is antibiotics, right? And so that's the classic anti-pseudomonals. That's inhaled tobramycin. That's inhaled aztreonam-caistin. But sometimes that can become difficult to treat, what we call multi-drug resistant. And so that list of some other things that I put up, like the phosphomycin, tobramycin, gallium, inhaled NO, are all other ways that we're trying to say, can we actually treat this with other types of approaches. That's one group. The other thing I think is that we've seen is that modulators, the CFTR modulators, when really effective, actually make it easier to fight off new infection. The people who started on Kalydeco, there was a group of them that actually, who'd only had Pseudomonas for a couple of months, that cleared it. My hope is that someday, when we actually really treat people early, there'll be a lot lower number of people that have Pseudomonas. So I don't know if there's any other comments from anyone else. You guys have any other comments? Yeah, perfect, Tony.
Just to get to the other part of your question, I think, is that Pseudomonas, even if it's not causing a quote-unquote big pneumonia and just hanging out there, that has some inflammatory component of it that your body reacts to it, and over time, years' time, it affects lung function and how good you can breathe. And the reason why it's so hard is not only is it resistant to some drugs, but this kind of Pseudomonas that's in patients with CF and some patients with COPD who have been smokers and have lung damage, it's got like a jello coating on it. It's not, just doesn't have a straight bacterial wall like your cells do. It's kind of, it must be a protective mechanism or something like this, but it's got, think about like a jello coating on it where it's hard for the drug to get to it. And that's why it sticks around for a long time too.
Good.
Well, that's yummy. So I have another question. So Patty, while you're going to the next person that has that in the room question, I'll ask this question, if that works. In particular, for triple combo study and also in general, how are participant slots allocated across care centers and research facilities? So that might be a Patty question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Say that again.
Yeah. In particular, for triple combo study and also in general, how are participant slots allocated across care centers and research facilities?
That's a great question. So, first of all, the sites that are doing the trial are selected by the sponsor of the trial. So we sometimes can make suggestions, because I work closely with the coordinating center, the TDN coordinating center. Sometimes we make suggestions that a certain site could use more trials, but really the sponsor themselves chooses the sites they would want to use for a trial. And there's only so many slots, 360 actually, for the 659-102 trial. So that's, they choose the number of sites, the sponsor does, and they also know how many patients they need enrolled. The way that they divide up site or enrollment slots per site, again, is also up to the sponsor. And right now, it appears that if a site is open, they can start enrolling patients right away. And it's really when they get a little further down in the trial where the slots are so limited and only certain sites will be open to enrollment. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but the other thing is we really encourage referrals. So if you're a patient at one center and want to participate in a trial that your site's not doing, we really encourage you to use the trial finder and reach out and be referred to another center to participate in a trial, not to change your care center, but to go to another place to participate in research. Well, in these very competitive trials, most likely that won't happen, that the slots will get filled at the site that's doing the trial. And if anyone has more questions about that, we can talk after the meeting. I'll be here. But my friend here has a question.
Hi, would you be able to talk a little bit about the use of long-term antibiotics like azithromycin for healthy lungs to prevent colonization of certain bugs? Just have seen differing opinions on the use of this lately.
So you're talking in cystic fibrosis, taking antibiotics to try to prevent.
Healthy lungs, yeah.
Yeah, well, so I'll start off, and then other people may have some comments as well. I mean, I think we are pretty confident based on data that being aggressive when you first get some of those bacteria is the right thing to do. And also, as Tony mentioned, because of the chronic inflammation that comes from chronic infection, that using chronic antibiotics is helpful to try to keep that in check. We know that as well. I think your question is more, what if you don't have that infection? Should you actually be taking this to prevent getting it? And I'll tell you that there's some potential problems with that, although, and the one study that we particularly have is actually one that's from England. And so what they did is, remember when you're younger, you tend to be more at risk for things like staph infections or H. flu infections, and then later on you can sometimes get Pseudomonas as you get older. That in the English study they said, hey, let's start treating all the kids with medicines, with antibiotics to prevent them from getting staph infections, since we know that's what they get first. So they started taking this, they were basically preventing the staph infection, but then when they looked, they were actually increasing the rate of getting Pseudomonas. Because really the lungs are a community, right? So we all have bacteria. We all have some normal, what we call normal flora in our lungs. But that in cystic fibrosis, that flora gets out of whack, and there's certain bacteria that they're susceptible to. So this is a long way of saying I think that we're a little hesitant to say treat prophylactically to try to prevent anything coming out. The current data would suggest that you keep monitoring really quickly, and if you do see something come, you're aggressive in getting it. So part of this is because we only have so many different antibiotics. We're not afraid to use them, but we probably don't want to be just using them all the time before you have any evidence of that, because we don't have evidence that would prevent being able to acquire those, if that makes sense. So I don't know, Dara, Tony, anyone else?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. So yes, go heavy with the antibiotics and hard later on, but I would actually not go too heavy when you don't have anything. Yeah.
So we have another online question, and then Patty, we maybe have time for two more.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left.
We can go a little longer if we need to. That's fine. Or come up afterwards.
So I have a child with the Delta F508, and the other mutation is a rare mutation, and up to now she has not been a candidate for new therapies. Are there any new clinical trials that will help the CF patient? I think the resounding answer is...
Wait, one F508 now?
Yeah.
Oh, and a rare mutation. Oh, so you want to answer that one, Dara? Dara, sounds like you know the answer.
Yes. Yeah, the triple. The triple is one F508 del, and the other mutation doesn't matter.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that one more time, just because I know there's so many mutations flying around and so many combinations and so many things going on, it's easy to get confused. But everything we see so far, it looks like for the triple, if you have one F508 del, it doesn't matter what the other mutation is, right? So yes, it's going to benefit people with two F508 dels for sure. Again, we always have to sort of see the final results, so we don't want to count the chickens before they hatch. But everything so far looks so promising. But the key thing is one F508 del, it's very likely, and all the data so far says that's going to benefit you no matter what your other mutation is.
So Mike, help me understand this. Does this mean if I want to be in the trial, the 659102 trial, but my research coordinator told me I can't because my second mutation isn't on that list, and yet you're telling me the drug might help me? This is confusing.
Okay, so that's a good question. Might jump in this. So there's a difference between whether or not it will eventually help you and whether or not you're actually be eligible to be in the trial right now, right? So the trial that's starting, the one with just single F508 del, they want to make sure, yes, one of the mutations is F508 del, but they want the other mutation to be one that they know isn't treated at all by the modulators, because otherwise it gets confusing. You're trying to figure out which one are we treating, which one are we testing. So right now, if you look, for instance, with the 659 online, there's a long list of mutations, and those are basically all ones that we know, or at least we think, don't respond to the triple. And that way, they're going to be able to test just the effect of a single F508 del. So for getting into the trial, yes, that trial you need F508 del, and you need to have it on that list. If you know you have a really rare stop mutation or something that doesn't make mutations, that's not on the list, you can talk to your care center, and they could appeal to Vertex, but it has to be one that doesn't make any protein. But that doesn't mean that that's the only group that'll benefit. That's because we're starting with sort of the lowest, or maybe say the highest part. The hardest thing to treat is people with just one F508 del. So that group is being studied, but those people that will continue down the road to benefit no matter what the other one is, as long as they have that single F508 del. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but I don't know, any
Thank
clarifications?
you.
No.
Thank you. Any other questions? Way up there. All right. And this is probably the
Run,
last.
Patty, run!
I'm trying.
Run, Patty!
Probably the last question. Make it good.
I'll
Don't
make
be
it good.
wasting our time.
This question is for Tony.
Patty, wow, zing.
I'm interested in the process that you're trying to develop for the in vitro investigations, especially for folks with nonsense and rare and the 5% that's not going to be affected by the modulators. What is the process for getting on label? How are we going to interact with our doctors and pharmaceutical companies ultimately to get our very rare mutations approved?
Well, let's start with the company that has this going on right now. And with regard to rare mutations and using in vitro data right now, the way things go is that there's a genetic construct. They're actually rat cells that are transfected with different mutations, CFTR mutations, a single one, not two like there are in people. And to look at whether the drug has an effect and how much of an effect it has, they culture these cells, put the drug on it, and measure chloride channel activity. It's kind of an electrophysiological thing. So that test is applicable to really just Vertex products because in the context of approving it, there was an inspection of the laboratory, how they did the test, the statistical analysis of it. The FDA pretty much redid the experiments, virtually, and said and came to the conclusion that if it goes above this amount, it's reasonable that it's going to have an effect. So the one thing that you need to know about that test is that test, as it is, resides with Vertex. It's not like they have a trademark or anything, but that they're the only company's lab that's been inspected and looked at like that. So a different company would have to propose their test and go through it. And it would be much more beneficial if there was a consortium or something like that we had one test that everybody's happy with to do this kind of stuff with. Now, with regard to rare mutations, the really rare ones, the ones that Mike was mentioning aren't on that giant table for the study that's just started, that depends, at least in the current system that's being used, in having the cell with that mutation added to it. And that's a scientific kind of thing about getting the CFTR specific mutation in there. And there's probably 50 or so that have that in there, but I know the Vertex company is developing more of those cells with different more rare, I'm doing my English thing, mutations in there to be able to test for a wider array. So in the future, I would expect as fast as they can do it, especially with this triple combination coming in, that they would have many more mutations in cells to be able to test and use that avenue as to get access to the drug. That might be longer. It's a long thing, but we could talk afterward if you want.
So I think we're actually officially
Yep,
needing
we're
to like ring the bell and move to the next session if you're interested. So thank you. You know what? This is an incredibly exciting time. I think every time we get together, we're going to hear about advances. I look forward to continue to talk about those things. If you have questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to come up afterwards, and we're happy to answer them. Thanks, everybody.